I was 18 when my sister, Natalie Harris, told me I was an embarrassment. She didn't raise her voice. That simply wasn't Natalie's approach. She spoke as if it was an accepted truth she'd already made up her mind about. I complicate things more than necessary. It's draining for Natalie. At the time, my sister was studying pre-law, already behaving as if every opportunity would greet her before she ever had to seek it out. I was majoring in psychology, juggling 2 jobs, and losing countless hours of sleep worrying about the problems nobody else in my family would discuss, especially the things I discovered in my father's office, particularly papers he assumed I couldn't make sense of. 10 days after that conversation, I arrived home to find the locks had been switched. There wasn't any letter, no heads up, just a garbage bag of my clothing left on the front steps, still wet from the sprinklers. My mother hid behind the living room curtains, pretending she wasn't looking. When I knocked but she didn't answer the door, I waited. After a minute, my phone vibrated. Her text said, "This is what happens when you cross boundaries." They called me unstable, said I was too emotional. In reality, I wasn't falling apart. Instead, I was starting to see the truth. I had walked off with a single file, just one document. It was a report that tied a private security firm my father, Victor Harris, once advised to several misconduct incidents hidden deep in bureaucratic red tape. I didn't leak it to the media. I never even confronted him about it. I submitted the report discreetly through official procedures. 3 weeks later, I got a call. It wasn't a reporter on the other end, but someone in recruitment. The person on the line explained that my name appeared on an internal recommendations list. At first, I thought I was being teased. Then I recalled a phrase my aunt used to share before she passed away. Occasionally, the door that closes on you is simply clearing the way for another that bursts into existence even more forcefully. So I left Albuquerque. There was nothing like a tearful farewell. I carried no suitcase, only a backpack slung over my shoulder. 2 course books and a folder stuffed with student loan forms sat in my bag. They never served any purpose for me. I didn't share my destination with anyone. Not out of fear, but because I needed to create a self they could never reach again. The first bus heading out pulled away at 2:57 a.m. I stared as the desert slowly vanished behind me, bit by bit. By sunrise, I had settled on a different name for myself. By evening, I was without a place to stay, but for the first time, I had a purpose. In the restroom stall of a Greyhound stop just outside Santa Fe, I used a pair of shears meant for textiles to trim my hair. I watched my lengthy black locks fall against the porcelain, like fading remnants of a story I no longer needed to justify to anyone. I didn't allow myself to pause and cry. I acted immediately, cutting away relentlessly until the person staring back from the glass was no longer recognizable as myself. I took on the identity of Morgan Reed at a modest day labor agency located 2 towns away. It was enough to get work, but left little trace for anyone to follow. In the first several weeks, I found rest wherever I could feel safe. At times, I found a spot on a shelter's floor, and on other nights, I tucked myself into a dark corner of a laundromat that never asked questions. My jobs included scrubbing down diners before sunrise, organizing crates at warehouse loading docks, and dropping off food using a borrowed bicycle. Every penny I managed to earn went straight toward a single goal: paying for night classes. I enrolled in remote courses with the help of a scholarship program, uncertain whether I truly met the requirements. I aced each test as if nobody expected me to even show up for them. At one point, I split a 1-room apartment with 4 women, all older and living without papers. They didn't question my background, and I never pried into the reasons they prayed before every meal, their words spoken in a language I was unfamiliar with. We coexisted within an unspoken truce, each guarding a secret we weren't ready to share with others. Then, on a particular evening, A man named Mark Ellison left a business card for me at the reception of the job placement office. There was no formal title, only a government phone extension and a post-it note that read, "You did the right thing. Let's talk." I hesitated and didn't dial the number immediately. I kept the card tucked in my wallet for several weeks, worried it could be a setup, or worse, some kind of assessment. Yet somewhere inside, I sensed it was neither. Somebody had noticed what I reported, and rather than dismissing it, they made sure my name reached the appropriate hands. When I eventually called, Mark Ellison sounded unsurprised. "We've been watching you," he remarked directly. Not in a negative sense, more like I might fit in with them. I wasn't certain what that meant at the time, but I agreed nonetheless. And 7 weeks later, I found myself riding a train going north to Washington. My backpack felt noticeably heavier. My silence was finally making a statement, far louder than any apology that had never come my way. Langley had a reputation for breaking many people. It didn't break me, but it did scorch away my old self. I discovered how to function on 3.5 hours of sleep and a deep, steely determination. I learned to fire a gun without so much as a flinch, and to tell lies without even the slightest shake in my voice. Disappearing while out in the open became a skill I mastered. At first, my scores were simply average. It wasn't due to a lack of ability, but rather because I never sought the spotlight. In time, that became my greatest strength. People never look twice at the quiet person. Nobody keeps an eye on the one who doesn't seek recognition. When I reached graduation, I wasn't at the top of my class, but I wasn't last either. I was utterly ordinary, and that made me an ideal choice. I was assigned to a small division focused on cases from the Migrant Operations Division that were linked with money laundering enterprises. My job consisted of dissecting behavioral cues, cross-referencing travel documents, and tracing financial transactions. I pulled late shifts, covering nights, weekends, and all the holidays too. Constant activity felt safer than stopping to recall the reasons I'd landed there. The years slipped by. I rotated from city to city, assumed new identities, and completed my given missions. My superiors changed. Sometimes I reported to Morgan Reed, other times to whatever alias was necessary to keep our operations discreet and untraceable. Occasionally I speculated whether my mother, Marta Harris, ever lit a candle for me. Sometimes I preferred to believe that she never did. One particular night, I found myself alone in the Eugene Field office, scrolling through initial briefings, when a name I recognized suddenly appeared. I gazed at the monitor until my coffee had grown stale and cold. Western Legal Advisors appeared on a case tied to a client connected with a Santiera shell company. Yet, I immediately recognized that this name was a pseudonym. I knew exactly who that person truly was. Isabel Harris, my sister from birth. The same flourish in her signature. Identical law degree from New Mexico. The very same person who, years ago, told my parents in the kitchen that I posed a threat to the family's name. Now she found herself representing a client whose finances slipped through the very channels I had been investigating for 8 months. I kept my thoughts to myself. Not that evening, not with my supervisor, and not with the rest of the group. Still, I flagged the case and set it aside for reassignment using Special Audit 42B, a designation reserved for situations where close internal relationships could jeopardize external objectivity. They would come asking later. They always do. But I was already sure of my next move. I wasn't chasing memories anymore. I was stepping directly into the home I'd been ordered to abandon. I left my badge behind. I had no use for it. The courtroom was frigid, all glass and glossy wood panels, hidden at the back of a city government building. The ceilings reverberated with every silence. I slid into the last row during the pretrial arguments, wearing charcoal trousers and a dark jacket, blending in with the rest of the spectators. Initially, nobody took notice of me. Not the court clerk, not the bailiff, and not even her. I watched as my sister sat at the defense table, rifling through a binder as if the verdict was already certain. Her hair, shorter than I remembered, was styled tightly in a polished bun. Her lips were shaped with certainty. She appeared to be someone who had never needed to flee for her safety. Still, I recognized that posture intimately. I understood exactly what it concealed. The man seated next to her, her client, remained expressionless, his fingers tapping quietly atop the table. I recognized his face from the documents. He was accused of money laundering and wire fraud, with alleged connections to Santiera, but remained too spotless for an arrest and too influential to intimidate. And now Isabel was representing him. The session was strictly procedural, focused on motions to suppress and arguments over the chain of custody. But at that moment, the judge looked over at the audience. Her gaze locked with mine. She suddenly stopped. "Counsel," she began carefully as she faced my sister Isabel again, "is that Agent Morgan Reed in the rear row?" Though her voice was quiet, it reverberated through the room. I tensed up. The defense lawyer next to Isabel, an elderly man wearing a worn-out tie, followed the judge's line of vision. I watched as Isabel's expression changed, first puzzled, then full of realization. She blinked, once, then again, and set her jaw firmly. My mother, Marta Harris, was present as well. I hadn't realized she would attend. She occupied a seat 2 rows ahead, next to an unfamiliar man. Her rosary looped halfway through her fingers. She rotated in her chair gradually, as if a part of her had sensed it all along. While her face remained unchanged, her grip on the rosary beads tightened. Nobody mentioned my name again. The judge regained her composure and continued with the proceedings. The space maintained its rhythm, but each of my breaths was shallow. Journalists murmured quietly while hunched over their laptops. I noticed a woman in the audience begin to type. She typed something into her phone so quickly that her fingernails made a tapping sound on the screen. I remained completely unfazed. My posture was upright, with my hands resting neatly together. I wasn't there to take action. My purpose was simply to be noticed. Apparently, that alone made an impact. After they gavelled the hearing to a close, I got up, acknowledged the clerk with a single nod, and exited through the identical side entrance I'd used before. However, I didn't remove my coat, since I no longer needed to conceal myself. The invitation arrived 5 days after the hearing. It wasn't from my sister, nor from my mother. It came instead from a mutual cousin who I hadn't been in contact with for ages. She wrote, "Reconnect," as if nothing had ever fractured to begin with. "We'd really like for you to join us," the message read. "Just dinner. Just family." I accepted, not because I trusted their words, but because I wanted to see how much further they'd be willing to go. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The exterior was still painted the same beige, and the walls, along with the fragile front yard, greeted me as always. Stepping inside, I caught a whiff of citrus-scented cleaner mingled with the weight of lingering hopes. My mother met me at the entrance, her embrace coming a bit too slowly to feel genuine. My father waited tensely by the kitchen, his tie loosened and sleeves pushed up. My sister Isabel was seated silently at the far side of the table, a full glass of wine still resting before her. We ate enchiladas in the midst of uneasy conversation. They asked whether my job had left me exhausted. They remarked that the weather lately had been unusual. They mentioned that my posture looked good. Each of us kept up the pretense. Then, in the middle of a tale about a neighbor getting a promotion, my mother paused to clear her throat. She began, "We were just wondering," her fingers tightening around her napkin, "if you know anyone, someone at prosecutor's desk, who might be willing to review things one more time." Isabel Harris remained silent, her eyes fixed on her meal. My father chimed in, "It wouldn't have to be formal. Just..." and the conversation trailed off. You know how these situations usually go. I lifted my glass, then deliberately set it back down. If I weren't working with the Federal Investigations Bureau, I said in an even tone, would I be sitting here right now? Nothing. My mother, Marta Harris, had her mascara smeared at the edge of one eye. My father tugged at his cuffs, as if neatening his shirt could rewrite the past. Isabel, at last, met my gaze, genuinely met it, and I could sense she never thought I would refuse. But I already had, not through words, but in all the ways I'd changed during the years they avoided asking about. I folded my napkin neatly, set it alongside my dish, and got to my feet. They allowed me to leave. They simply watched as I exited once more. Only now, I didn't have to glance over my shoulder to understand that I wasn't the one leaving empty-handed. It appeared late on a Saturday, a fuzzy video less than a minute in length, blurry but absolutely recognizable. Me, 21 years old. At 21 years old, I was inebriated and carelessly laughing, exposed in a manner never intended for unknown viewers or prying lenses. I recognized the source immediately. He had once threatened to share it after our breakup. I believed it was gone. I believed I was safe. The sensational headlines erupted. Agents examined for misconduct. The Federal Investigations Bureau remained silent as the scandal deepened. They labeled it a moral failing. They described me as rash, compromised, and lacking professionalism. But they never named it for what it truly was: assault. My team descended into chaos. My immediate supervisor demanded that I provide a path for a public response. The legal department noted possible accusations of defamation. Human Resources arranged a check-in regarding my well-being, yet I stayed silent. I had no need to speak, since I had already endured the humiliation. I had long since buried the part of myself they sought to exploit. Suddenly my phone started ringing. My father's name, Victor Harris, illuminated the screen like a stranger's identity I hadn't uttered in years. I allowed it to ring twice before picking up. "You're dragging our family's reputation through the dirt," he barked at me, skipping any pleasantries or delay and moving straight to blame. To him, this was all a ploy for attention, a spiteful act, and he reminded me that my father and my mother had taught me better. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, allowing every word from his mouth to pour into me, letting the sound reverberate inside. I never tried to stir up trouble with my words. I bore that family name through hardship on my own, while you stood by and watched me get burned. There was a brief silence, just long enough to be significant. Then I heard a sharp disconnect as he ended the call. The following morning, I opened my email to find it inundated with inquiries from journalists. I rejected each request that came my way. Later that evening, I found myself in my apartment, reaching for the box stowed at the back of my closet, packed with weathered journals and hidden bus ticket stubs. I struck a lone match, letting the flame flicker as I watched the video one last time on my laptop. Afterward, I shut the computer, slid the box away once more into the shadows, and quietly murmured, "You don't get to prevail simply because I endured what you put me through." Then I refocused on my tasks, knowing the chaos they unleashed was a storm I had already faced, and I remained undeterred. I refrained from responding to their inquiries. I declined interview requests. I didn't issue an emotional apology or a meticulously scripted statement to the media. Instead, I began drafting legislation. The process began as a discreet sketch in my notebook at 4:15 a.m., while my phone buzzed with rumor passed off as reporting. That sketch evolved into a preliminary policy document. It then became a formal proposal. Eventually, it grew into something substantial. This was the Federal Kinship Interference Act, intended to shield whistleblowers and those in public service from being bullied, blackmailed, or threatened due to family connections. After all, it's often those nearest to you who make the strongest attempts to quiet your voice. I forwarded the initial version to appear on the integrity panel. No extra comments, just the content itself. The wording I used was precise, almost clinical. I knew exactly where the loopholes were because I had suffered from them myself. 7 weeks later, I received an invitation to provide testimony. Congressional Plaza, Room 302A, panel on governmental conduct. My outfit was navy blue. I skipped makeup and brought no one with me, relying solely on my notes and my recollections. "Thank you, Chairwoman," I started. "I'm not here to call out individuals. I came because some of the most intense pressure doesn't originate from reporters or outsiders. It comes from the homes I grew up in, from those who raised me, but later tried to take advantage." Silence hung in the room, not for lack of comprehension, but because the truth resonated with too many sitting there. I refrained from saying my father's name or my sister's, yet recognition still lit up their expressions. Still, a congresswoman from Ohio leaned in to ask a question. "Agent Morgan Reed," she inquired softly, "is this your personal story?" I held her gaze. "No," I replied. "It's about every person who has been in my position." The bill moved forward from committee with full bipartisan support. Journalists no longer referred to me as a scandal. They began calling me a strategist, sometimes even a reformer. The headlines finally grew sharper. I had transformed pain into legislation. When my own kin failed me, justice intervened. But my motivations lay elsewhere. My true reason was the girl I once was, the same girl who stood on a porch, clutching a garbage bag and lost for answers. The one who had been instructed to stay silent. And for those yet to come, so they never have to brave that inferno alone. Because legislation now protects them. A law no one anticipated. And my journey is still only beginning. She didn't schedule a meeting. Rachel Tran, my assistant, simply entered with an uneasy look and said, "She's in the lobby." I didn't ask who she meant. Somehow, I was already certain. Isabel Harris appeared in my doorway 2 minutes later, seeming smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her face was bare, without a trace of cosmetics, and there were no reporters standing behind her. She didn't offer any comforting words to soften what she felt. Only simple jeans, an unadorned shirt, and a silence that seemed content just to exist. I chose not to offer her a chair. Regardless, she sat down. We let the quiet stretch between us for a bit. The steady noise of the air vent filled the space between us. Eventually, she raised her eyes to meet mine. "I envied you," she confessed. "Even before I could understand it, you always stood out without effort, and I resented you for that." My sister's voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she continued. "I only needed to get that off my chest." I reclined in my seat, fingers interlaced. "You didn't ruin me," I murmured. "You just showed me how simple it was for people to move on without me." She acknowledged my words with a subtle nod. There were no tears, only a simple recognition that forgiveness wasn't what was happening. This was just reality. She didn't embrace me. She didn't offer any grand parting words. She rose to her feet, hesitated, and exited as quietly as she had arrived. I didn't look up to watch her departure. I simply reopened my laptop, skimmed to the next section of my report, and resumed my work. The forum wasn't broadcast. There were no journalists present, no microphones, just rows of folding chairs in a federal building filled with people who wore silence like armor. I took my place at the podium without any prepared remarks. I had no need for them. This was not about vengeance, I declared. It was a matter of safeguarding, for those who made the right choices and were abandoned as a result. I presented the Whistle Guard Network, a nationwide aid program for whistleblowers facing internal backlash because of family connections, especially within public service and law enforcement circles. Some attendees nodded, A few glanced at me through tears, and an attentive stillness signaled understanding rather than indifference. Seated at the back, my mother, Marta Harris, rested her hands in her lap, her gaze shining with unshed tears. She did not speak, though she stayed until everything concluded. My father was absent. He never inquired. That night, my sister sent a brief email, just 4 sentences. Thank you for voicing the truth. For everyone who couldn't say it themselves. I'm sorry I lacked more courage. You had it. I looked at her message once and then filed it away. Sometimes, things don't require a reply. Some hurts only need exposure and patience, and I was no longer the one responsible for addressing them. My purpose now was to give a voice to those who never had anyone to bear witness. The space was already crowded as I entered. I slipped inside without drawing attention. No media presence, no press credentials, just a simple jacket and a placard showing Morgan Reed. This wasn't my ceremony. It didn't have to be. Fresh recruits lined the stage, wearing sharp suits and exuding quiet confidence. Among them, one who seemed barely finished with college paused at the microphone and announced, "I'm here because of her," gesturing at the audience, and meaning me. A few people turned their heads, and some cameras snapped photos. Still, I remained seated and kept my hand down. I just sat there, taking in everything that was happening. Once the proceedings ended and the room began to empty, I felt a light touch on my arm. An elderly woman, herself a retired field agent, stood there. She told me, "You make us proud," not loudly, but with certainty. I nodded in response. "I'm proud of myself too," I replied, and I meant it. The cool air greeted me as I stepped outside. There weren't any journalists or camera flashes, just the evening's calm and the city carrying on. I made my way home, never pulling out my phone or glancing behind me. It wasn't out of indifference, but because I didn't need recognition to believe that what I'd done was meaningful. And for once, the quiet didn't feel isolating. Instead, it brought me a sense of peace.